Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Glad you're here. Glad you're still sticking around with me. I know I've been in and out a bit lately. I see some of you are giving me a little bit of grief in the Discord right now, too. That's okay. I love you guys anyway. Oh, man. I'm laughing at the gift that you just posted of how wooed. At least if I remember right, that's how she pronounced it. How wooed. Oh, man. Started my month feeling a little bit, yeah, but you asked me what I was laughing about, not what I was commenting on. What I laughed about was the GIF you posted. I glanced over and suddenly there's a little girl putting her hands on her hips and going, how wooed. And it's very amusing. Just wanted to make sure I was laughing at the funny thing you did. Okay. Well, I was. You were successful. I'm not wooed. You can't even decide how to spell wooed. I'm glad you're here too, Random. Even if you were giving me grief and going, ew. But I'm glad all of you are here. Oh, and Caramel Diaz, thank you for the follow. I was in between streams, so couldn't thank you live, but hopefully you're either here or catch the VOD, so thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the stories. I have old stories on YouTube, although I need to make sure to upload some of the more recent ones. Sounds like a good plan to me. I like the company. Well, we have been reading Tales from the Arabian Nights as Scheherazade tries to keep her head attached by telling stories that'll keep the Sultan on a cliffhanger, so he'll want to hear the continuation of the story the next day, which has resulted in stories that are stories within stories within stories. Well, I'll forgive you if your comebacks are not snappy then. So today we are starting with a tale called The Story of the Enchanted Horse. On the festival of the Nowruz, which is the first day of the year and of spring, the Sultan of Shiraz was just concluding his public audience when a Hindu appeared at the foot of the throne with an artificial horse, so spiritedly modeled that at first sight he was taken for a living animal. The Hindu prostrated himself before the throne and, pointing to the horse, said to the Sultan, "This horse is a great wonder. If I wish to be transported to the most distant parts of the earth, I have only to mount him. I offer to show your majesty this wonder, if you command me." The Sultan, who was very fond of everything that was curious, and who had never beheld or heard anything quite so strange as this, told the Hindu that he would like to see him perform what he had promised. The Hindu at once put his foot into the stirrup, swung himself into the saddle, and asked the Sultan whither he wished him to go. "Do you see yonder mountain?" said the Sultan, pointing to it. "Ride your horse there, and bring me a branch from the palm tree that grows at the foot of the hill." No sooner had the Sultan spoken than the Hindu turned a peg, which was in the hollow of the horse's neck, just by the pommel of the saddle, Instantly, the horse rose from the ground and bore his rider into the air with the speed of lightning, to the amazement of the Sultan and all the spectators. Within less than a quarter of an hour, they saw him returning with the palm branch in his hand. Alighting amidst the acclamations of the people, he dismounted and, approaching the throne, laid the palm branch at the Sultan's feet. The Sultan, still marveling at this unheard-of sight, was fixed with a great desire to possess the horse, and said to the Hindu, "I will buy him of you, if he is for sale." "Sire," replied the Hindu, "there is only one condition on which I will part with my horse, namely, the hand of the princess, your daughter, as my wife." The courtiers surrounding the Sultan's throne could not restrain their laughter at the Hindu's extravagant proposal. But Prince Feroz Shah, the Sultan's eldest son, was very indignant. "Sire," said he, "I hope that you will at once refuse this impudent demand, and not allow this miserable juggler to flatter himself for a moment with the hope of marriage with one of the most powerful houses in the world. Think what you owe to yourself and to your noble blood." "My son," replied the Sultan, "I will not grant him what he asks. But putting my daughter, the princess, out of the question, I may make a different bargain with him. First, however, I wish you to examine the horse. Try him yourself and tell me what you think of him." By the way, the tea today is, it's a magical flying horse. The tea today is Darjeeling. So the issue is the price, not the fact that the princess isn't being consulted on the matter? Okay. I mean, what should he have done? Shown up with a whole menagerie and a genie in a flying carpet and banging drums, and, a fancy hat. Just charge through the middle of town. You feel bad for the horse. It's not a living horse, though. It's like a flying horse from a merry-go-round. Carousel. Whatever you call them. On hearing this, the Hindu eagerly ran forward to help the prince mount, and show him how to guide and manage the horse. But, without waiting for the Hindu's assistance, the prince mounted and turned the peg as he had seen the other do. Instantly the horse darted into the air, swift as an arrow shot from a bow. In a few moments, neither horse nor prince could be seen. The Hindu, alarmed at what had happened, threw himself before the throne and begged the Sultan not to be angry. "Your Majesty," he said, "saw as well as I with what speed the horse flew away. The surprise took away my power of speech. But even if I could have spoken to advise him, he was already too far away to hear me. There is still room to hope, however, that the prince will discover that there is another peg, and as soon as he turns that, the horse will cease to rise and will descend gently to the ground." Notwithstanding these arguments, the Sultan was much alarmed at his son's evident danger, and said to the Hindu, "Your head shall answer for my son's life, unless he returns safe in 3 months' time, or unless I hear that he is alive." He then ordered his officers to secure the Hindu and keep him a close prisoner, after which he retired to his palace, sorrowing that the festival of Nowruz had ended so unluckily. I mean, to be fair, the prince kind of arrogantly just, went for it instead of figuring out how it operated. Meanwhile, the prince was carried through the air with fearful rapidity. In less than an hour he had mounted so high that the mountains and plains below him all seemed to melt together. Then, for the first time, he began to think of returning, and to this end he began turning the peg, first one way and then the other, at the same time pulling upon the bridle. But when he found that the horse continued to ascend, he was greatly alarmed, and deeply repented of his folly in not learning to guide the horse before he mounted. He now began to examine the horse's head and neck very carefully, and discovered, behind the right ear, a second peg, smaller than the first. He turned this peg, and presently felt that he was descending in the same oblique manner as he had mounted, but not so swiftly. Night was already approaching when the prince discovered and turned the small peg, and as the horse descended, he gradually lost sight of the sun's last setting rays, until presently it was quite dark. He was obliged to let the bridle hang loose, and wait patiently for the horse to choose his own landing place, whether it might be in the desert, in the river, or in the sea. At last, about midnight, the horse stopped upon solid ground, and the prince dismounted, faint with hunger, for he had eaten nothing since the morning. He found himself on the terrace of a magnificent palace, and groping about, he presently reached a staircase which led down into an apartment, the door of which was half open. The prince stopped and listened at the door, then advanced cautiously into the room, and by the light of a lamp saw a number of slaves sleeping with their naked swords beside them. This was evidently the guard chamber of some sultan or princess. Advancing on tiptoe, he drew aside the curtain and saw a magnificent chamber containing many beds, one of which was placed higher than the others on a raised dais, evidently the beds of the princess and her women. He crept softly toward the dais and beheld a beauty so extraordinary that he was charmed at the first sight. He fell on his knees and gently twitched the sleeve of the princess, who opened her eyes and was greatly surprised to see a handsome young man bending over her, yet showed no sign of fear. The prince rose to his feet, and bowing to the ground said, "Beautiful princess, through a most extraordinary adventure, you see at your feet a suppliant prince, son of the Sultan of Persia, who prays for your assistance and protection." "Hey, Gecko, glad you're here." If I woke up to some strange dude bending over me like that and I had a room full of guards next door, I'd be calling for them to, off with his head. But that's me. I'm not big on waking up to the faces of strange dudes bending over me, handsome or otherwise. In answer to this appeal of Prince Firoz Shah, the beautiful princess said, "Prince, you are not in a barbarous country, but in the kingdom of the Raja of Bengal. This is his country estate, and I am his eldest daughter. I will grant you the protection that you ask, and you may depend upon my word." The Prince of Persia would have thanked the princess, but she would not let him speak. "Impatient though I am," said she, "to know by what miracle you have come here from the capital of Persia, and by what enchantment you escaped the watchfulness of my guards. Yet I will restrain my curiosity until later, after you have rested from your fatigue." The princess's women were much surprised to see a prince in her bedchamber, but they at once prepared to obey her command, and conducted him into a handsome apartment. Here, while some prepared the bed, others brought and served a welcome and bountiful supper. The next day the princess prepared to receive the prince, and took more pains in dressing and adorning herself than she had ever done before. She decked her neck, head, and arms with the finest diamonds she possessed, and clothed herself in the richest fabric of the Indies, of a most beautiful color, and made only for kings, princes, and princesses. After once more consulting her glass, she sent word to the Prince of Persia that she would receive him. The prince, who had just finished dressing when he received the princess's message, hastened to avail himself of the honor conferred on him. He told her of the wonders of the enchanted horse, of his wonderful journey through the air, and of the means by which he had gained entrance to her chamber. Then, after thanking her for her kind reception, he expressed a wish to return home and relieve the anxiety of the Sultan, his father. The princess replied, "I cannot approve, Prince, of your leaving so soon. Grant me the favor of a somewhat longer visit, so that you may take back to the court of Persia a better account of what you have seen in the kingdom of Bengal." The prince could not well refuse the princess this favor, after the kindness she had shown him, and she busied herself with plans for hunting parties, concerts, and magnificent feasts to render his stay agreeable. For 2 whole months the Prince of Persia abandoned himself entirely to the will of the princess, who seemed to think that he had nothing to do but pass his whole life with her. But at last he declared that he could stay no longer and begged leave to return to his father. "And, Princess," he added, "if I were not afraid of giving offense, I would ask the favor of taking you along with me." The princess made no answer to this address of the Prince of Persia, but her silence and downcast eyes told him plainly that she had no reluctance to accompany him. Her only fear, she confessed, was that the prince might not know well enough how to govern the horse. But the prince soon removed her fear by assuring her that after the experience he had had, he defied the Hindu himself to manage the horse better. Accordingly, they gave all their thoughts to planning how to get away secretly from the palace, without anyone having a suspicion of their design. The next morning, a little before daybreak, when all the attendants were still asleep, they made their way to the terrace of the palace. The prince turned the horse toward Persia, and as soon as the princess had mounted behind him, and was well settled with her arms about his waist, he turned the peg, whereupon the horse mounted into the air with his accustomed speed, and in 2 hours' time they came in sight of the Persian capital. So I am. Thanks, fella. Sorry. There you go. Cool sand art patterns. No background music now, though. Instead of alighting at the palace, the prince directed his course to a kiosk a little distance outside the city. He led the princess into a handsome apartment, ordered the attendants to provide her with whatever she needed, and told her that he would return immediately after informing his father of their arrival. Thereupon he ordered a horse to be brought and set out for the palace. The sultan received his son with tears of joy and listened eagerly while the prince related his adventures during his flight through the air, his kind reception at the palace of the Princess of Bengal, and his long stay there due to their mutual affection. He added that, having promised to marry her, he had persuaded her to accompany him to Persia. "I brought her with me on the enchanted horse," he concluded, "and left her in your summer palace till I could return and assure her of your consent." Upon hearing these words, the sultan embraced his son a second time, and said to him, "My son, I not only consent to your marriage with the Princess of Bengal, but will myself go and bring her to the palace, and your wedding shall be celebrated this very day." The sultan now ordered that the Hindu should be released from prison and brought before him. When this was done, the sultan said, "I held you prisoner that your life might answer for that of the prince, my son. Thanks be to God he has returned safely. Go, take your horse, and never let me see your face again." The Hindu had learned of those who brought him from prison all about the princess whom Prince Firoz Shah had brought with him and left at the kiosk, and at once he began to think of revenge. He mounted his horse and flew directly to the kiosk, where he told the captain of the guard that he came with orders to conduct the Princess of Bengal through the air to the sultan, who awaited her in the great square of his palace. The captain of the guard, seeing that the Hindu had been released from prison, believed his story, and the princess at once consented to do what the prince, as she thought, desired of her. The Hindu, overjoyed at the ease with which his wicked plan was succeeding, mounted his horse, took the princess up behind him, turned the peg, and instantly the horse mounted into the air. Meanwhile, the Sultan of Persia, attended by his court, was on the road to the kiosk where the Princess of Bengal had been left, while the prince himself had hurried on ahead to prepare the princess to receive his father. Suddenly the Hindu, to brave them both and avenge himself for the ill treatment he had received, appeared over their heads with his prize. When the Sultan saw the Hindu, his surprise and anger were all the more keen because it was out of his power to punish this outrageous act. He could only stand and hurl 1,000 maledictions at him, as did also the courtiers who witnessed this unequaled piece of insolence. But the grief of Prince Firoz Shah was indescribable when he beheld the Hindu bearing away the princess whom he loved so passionately. He made his way, melancholy and broken-hearted, to the kiosk where he had last taken leave of the princess. Here, the captain of the guard, who had already learned of the Hindu's treachery, threw himself at the prince's feet, and condemned himself to die by his own hand because of his fatal credulity. "Rise," said the prince. "I blame not you, but my own want of precaution for the loss of my princess. But lose no time. Bring me a dervish's robe, and take care that you give no hint that it is for me." When the captain of the guard had procured the dervish's robe, the prince at once disguised himself in it, and taking with him a box of jewels, left the palace, resolved not to return until he had found his princess, or perish in the attempt. Meanwhile, the Hindu, mounted on his enchanted horse, with the princess behind him, arrived at the capital of the kingdom of Kashmir. He did not enter the city, but alighted in a wood, and left the princess on a grassy spot close to a rivulet of fresh water, while he went to seek food. On his return, and after he and the princess had partaken of refreshment, he began to maltreat the princess, because she refused to become his wife. Now, it happened that the Sultan of Kashmir and his court were passing through the wood on their return from hunting, and hearing a woman's voice calling for help, went to her rescue. The Hindu, with great impudence, asked what business anyone had to interfere, since the lady was his wife. Whereupon the princess cried out, "My lord, whoever you are whom heaven has sent to my assistance, have compassion on me. I am a princess. This Hindu is a wicked magician who has forced me away from the Prince of Persia, whom I was to marry, and has brought me hither on the enchanted horse that you see there." The princess's beauty, majestic air, and tears all declared that she spoke the truth. Justly enraged at the Hindu's insolence, the Sultan of Kashmir ordered his guards to seize him and strike off his head, which sentence was immediately carried out. The princess's joy was unbounded at finding herself rescued from the wicked Hindu. She supposed that the Sultan of Kashmir would at once restore her to the Prince of Persia, but she was much deceived in these hopes, for her rescuer had resolved to marry her himself the next day, and issued a proclamation commanding the general rejoicing of the inhabitants. The Princess of Bengal was awakened at break of day by drums and trumpets and sounds of joy throughout the palace, but was far from guessing the true cause. When the Sultan came to wait upon her, he explained that these rejoicings were in honor of their marriage, and begged her to consent to the union. On hearing this, the princess fainted away. The serving women who were present ran to her assistance, but it was long before they could bring her back to consciousness. When at last she recovered, she resolved that sooner than be forced to marry the Sultan of Kashmir, she would pretend that she had gone mad. Accordingly, she began to talk wildly and show other signs of a disordered mind, even springing from her seat as if to attack the Sultan, so that he became greatly alarmed and sent for all the court physicians to ask if they could cure her of her disease. When he found that his court physicians could not cure her, he sent for the most famous doctors in his kingdom, who had no better success. Next, he sent word to the courts of neighboring sultans, with promises of generous reward to anyone who could cure her malady. Physicians arrived from all parts and tried their skill, but none could boast of success. Meanwhile, Prince Firoz Shah, disguised as a dervish, traveled through many provinces and towns, everywhere inquiring about his lost princess. At last, in a certain city of Hindustan, he learned of a princess of Bengal who had gone mad on the day of her intended marriage with the Sultan of Kashmir. Convinced that there could be but one princess of Bengal, he hastened to the capital of Kashmir, and upon arriving was told the story of the princess and the fate of the Hindu magician. The prince was now convinced that he had at last found the beloved object of his long search. Providing himself with the distinctive dress of a physician, he went boldly to the palace and announced his wish to be allowed to attempt a cure of the princess. Since it was now some time since any physician had offered himself, the Sultan had begun to lose hope of ever seeing the princess cured, though he still wished to marry her. So he at once ordered the new physician to be brought before him, and upon the prince being admitted, told him that the princess could not bear the sight of a physician without falling into the most violent paroxysms. Accordingly, he conducted the prince to a closet from which he might see her through a lattice, without himself being seen. There, Firoz Shah beheld his lovely princess sitting in hopeless sorrow, the tears flowing from her beautiful eyes, while she sang a plaintive air deploring her unhappy fate. Upon leaving the closet, the prince told the sultan that he had assured himself that the princess's complaint was not incurable, but that if he was to aid her, he must speak with her in private and alone. The sultan ordered the princess's chamber door to be opened, and Firoz Shah went in. Immediately the princess resorted to her old practice of meeting physicians with threats and indications of attacking them. But Firoz Shah came close to her and said in so low a voice that only she could hear, "Princess, I am not a physician, but Firoz Shah, and I have come to obtain your liberty." The princess, who knew the sound of his voice and recognized him, notwithstanding he had let his beard grow so long, grew calm at once, and was filled with secret joy at the unexpected sight of the prince she loved. After they had briefly informed each other of all that had happened since their separation, the prince asked if she knew what had become of the horse after the death of the Hindu magician. She replied that she did not know, but supposed that he was carefully guarded as a curiosity. Firoz Shah then told the princess that he intended to obtain and use the horse to convey them both back to Persia, and they planned together, as the first step to this end, that the princess the next day should receive the sultan. On the following day, the sultan was overjoyed to find that the princess's cure was apparently far advanced, and regarded the prince as the greatest physician in the world. The prince of Persia, who accompanied the sultan on his visit to the princess, inquired of him how she had come into the kingdom of Kashmir from her far distant country. The sultan then repeated the story of the Hindu magician, adding that the enchanted horse was kept safely in his treasury as a great curiosity, though he knew not how to use it. "Sire," replied the pretended physician, "this information affords me a means of curing the princess. When she was brought hither on the enchanted horse, she contracted part of the enchantment, which can be dispelled only by a certain incense of which I have knowledge. Let the horse be brought tomorrow into the great square before the palace, and leave the rest to me. I promise to show you and all your assembled people, in a few moments' time, the Princess of Bengal completely restored in body and mind. But to assure the success of what I propose, the princess must be dressed as magnificently as possible, and adorned with the most valuable jewels in your treasury." All this the sultan eagerly promised, for he would have undertaken far more difficult things to assure his marriage with the princess. The next day, the enchanted horse was taken from the treasury and brought to the great square before the palace. The rumor of something extraordinary having spread through the town, crowds of people flocked thither from all sides. The Sultan of Kashmir, surrounded by his nobles and ministers of state, occupied a gallery erected for the purpose. The Princess of Bengal, attended by her ladies-in-waiting, went up to the enchanted horse, and the women helped her to mount. The pretended physician then placed around the horse many vessels full of burning charcoal, into which he cast handfuls of incense, after which he ran 3 times around the horse, pretending to utter certain magic words. The pots sent forth a dark cloud of smoke that surrounded the princess, so that neither she nor the horse could be seen. The prince mounted nimbly behind her and turned the peg, and as the horse rose with them into the air, the sultan distinctly heard these words: "Sultan of Kashmir, when you would marry princesses who implore your protection, learn first to obtain their consent." Thus the prince delivered the Princess of Bengal, and carried her that same day to the capital of Persia, where the sultan his father made immediate preparation for the solemnization of their marriage, with all fitting pomp and magnificence. After the days appointed for rejoicing were over, the sultan named and appointed an ambassador to go to the Rajah of Bengal, to ask his approval of the alliance contracted by this marriage, which the Rajah of Bengal took as an honor and granted with great pleasure and satisfaction. Hey, look at that. Consent, not a new theme in literature. Crazy. Here we've got a new one. Or rather not a new one, but a good one that you guys have probably heard before. At least a little bit. This is the story of Sinbad the Sailor. Everybody heard any stories or seen any animes or anything referring to Sinbad the Sailor? Used to be a bunch of cheesy old movies about it too. In the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there dwelt in Baghdad a poor porter named Sinbad, who often had to carry heavy burdens, which he could scarcely support. One very hot day, he was laboring along a strange street, and overcome by fatigue, he sat down near a great house to rest. The porter complimented himself upon his good fortune in finding such a pleasant place, for while he sat, there reached his ears sweet sounds of music, and his senses were also soothed by sweet smells. Wondering who lived in so fine a house, he inquired of one of the servants. "What," said the man, "do you not know that Sinbad the Sailor, the famous circumnavigator of the world, lives here?" "Alas," replied Sinbad, "what a difference there is between Sinbad's lot and mine. Yet what greater merits does he possess that he should prosper, and I starve?" Now Sinbad happened to overhear this remark, and anxious to see a man who expressed such strange views, he sent for Sinbad. Accordingly, Sinbad was led into the great hall, where there was a sumptuous repast spread, and a goodly company assembled. The poor porter felt very uncomfortable, until Sinbad bade him draw near, and seating him at his right hand, served him himself, and gave him excellent wine, of which there was abundance upon the sideboard. When the repast was over, Sinbad asked him why he complained of his condition. "My lord," replied Sinbad, "I confess that my fatigue put me out of humor, and occasioned me to utter some indiscreet words, which I beg you to pardon." "Do not think I am so unjust," resumed Sinbad, "as to resent such a complaint. But that you may know that my wealth has not been acquired without labor, I recite the history of my travels for your benefit, and I think that, when you have heard it, you will acknowledge how wonderful have been my adventures." Sinbad then related the story of his first voyage as follows. The First Voyage. When still a very young man, I inherited a large fortune from my father, and at once set about amusing myself. I lived luxuriously, and soon found that money was decreasing, while nothing was added to replace expenditure. Quickly seeing the folly of my ways, I invested the remainder of my fortune with some merchants of Bussorah, and joined them in their voyage, which was toward the Indies by way of the Persian Gulf. In our voyage we touched at several islands, where we sold or exchanged our goods. One day, while under sail, we were becalmed near a small island, but little elevated above the level of the water, and resembling a green meadow. The captain ordered his sails to be furled, and permitted such persons as were so inclined to land. Of this number I was one. But, while we were enjoying ourselves and eating and drinking, and recovering ourselves from the fatigue of the sea, the island on a sudden trembled, and shook us terribly. The trembling of the island was perceived on board the ship, and we were called upon to re-embark speedily, or we should all be lost, for what we took for an island proved to be the back of a sea monster. The nimblest got into the sloop, others betook themselves to swimming, but for myself, I was still upon the back of the creature when he dived into the sea, and I had time only to catch hold of a piece of wood that we had brought out of the ship to make a fire. Meanwhile, the captain, having received those on board who were in the sloop, and taken up some of those that swam, resolved to improve the favorable gale that had just risen, and hoisting his sails, pursued his voyage, so that it was impossible for me to recover the ship. Thus was I exposed to the mercy of the waves. I struggled for my life all the rest of the day and the following night. By this time, I found my strength gone, and despaired of saving my life, when happily a wave threw me up against an island. I struggled up the steep bank by aid of some roots, and lay down on the ground half dead until the sun appeared. Then, though I was very feeble, both from hard labor and want of food, I crept along to find some herbs fit to eat, and had the good luck not only to procure some, but likewise to discover a spring of excellent water, which contributed much to recover me. As I advanced farther into the island, I was not a little surprised and startled to hear a voice and see a man who asked me who I was. I related to him my adventure, after which, taking me by the hand, he led me into a cave where there were several other people, no less amazed to see me than I was to see them. I partook of some provisions which they offered me. I then asked them what they did in such a desert place, to which they answered that they were grooms belonging to the Maharaja, sovereign of the island, and that they were about to lead the king's horses back to the palace. They added that they were to return home on the morrow, and had I been 1 day later, I must have perished, because the inhabited part of the island was at a great distance, and it would have been impossible for me to have got thither without a guide. When the grooms set out, I accompanied them, and was duly presented to the Maharaja, who was much interested in my adventure, and bade me stay with him as long as I desired. Being a merchant, I met with men of my own profession, and particularly inquired for those who were strangers, that perchance I might hear news from Baghdad, or find an opportunity to return. For the Maharaja's capital is situated on the sea-coast, and has a fine harbor, where ships arrive daily from the different quarters of the world. I frequented also the society of the learned Indians, and took delight to hear them converse. But withal I took care to make my court regularly to the Maharaja, and conversed with the governors and petty kings, his tributaries, that were about him. They put 1,000 questions respecting my country, and I, being willing to inform myself as to the laws and customs, asked them concerning everything which I thought worth knowing. There belongs to this king an island named Cassel. They assured me that every night a noise of drums was heard there, whence the mariners fancied that it was from the residence of the Degial. I determined to visit this wonderful place, and in my way thither saw fishes of 100 and 200 cubits long, that occasion more fear than hurt, for they are so timorous that they will fly upon the rattling of 2 sticks or boards. I saw likewise other fish, which had heads like owls. I was one day at the port after my return. The ship in which I had set sail arrived, and the crew began to unload the goods. I saw my own bales with my name upon them, and going up to the captain said, "I am that Sinbad whom you thought to be dead, and those bales are mine." When the captain heard me speak thus, he exclaimed, "Heavens! Whom can we trust in these times? There is no faith left among men. I saw Sinbad perish with my own eyes, as did also the passengers on board. And yet you tell me you are that Sinbad? What impudence is this? To look on you, one would take you to be a man of probity, and yet you tell a horrible falsehood in order to possess yourself of what does not belong to you." After much discussion, the captain was convinced of the truth of my words, and having seen me identified by members of the crew, he handed me over my goods, congratulating me on my escape. I took what was most valuable in my bales and presented them to the Maharaja, who, knowing my misfortune, asked me how I came by such rarities. I acquainted him with the circumstance of their recovery. He was pleased at my good luck, accepted my present, and in return gave me one much more considerable. Thereupon I took leave of him and went aboard the same ship, after I had exchanged my goods for the commodities of that country. We passed by several islands, and at last arrived at Bassorah, from whence I came to this city with the value of 100,000 sequins. Sinbad stopped here, and ordered the musicians to proceed with their concert, which the story had interrupted. The company continued enjoying themselves till the evening, and it was time to retire, when Sinbad sent for a purse of 100 sequins, and giving it to the porter said, "Take this, Sinbad. Return to your home and come back tomorrow to hear more of my adventures." The porter went away, astonished at the honor done, and the present made him, and arrayed in his best apparel, returned to Sinbad's house next day. After he had graciously received and feasted his guest, Sinbad continued his narrative. So, is it just me, or did that sound like Sinbad got his wealth because he inherited most of it from his father, then reinvested the inherited wealth, got kind of screwed over, told a hard luck story to somebody else who was rich, and then once it was proved that he was actually rich, got given more money? It doesn't really sound like earning a fortune through labor. It sounds like an accident of birth, compounding into other accidents. But hey, maybe that's just me. Anyway, we will pick up with Sinbad's second voyage and probably his third voyage next week. So I hope you all come back and join me for that. Hope you enjoyed the story today, even though it was kind of short. And I'm really glad to see all of you here. Thank you for coming and hanging out with me for a little bit. I'm really glad, guys. All right. I'll catch all of you later. Have an excellent day, morning, evening, whatever it happens to be, wherever you are. And good night.